Alright, so my name is Justine, and today I am going to be responding to Anna's claim being that abolishing voter ID laws would increase voter participation in elections. And my opponent's secondary claims were 1, that voter ID laws suppress voters, 2, voter ID laws decrease voter turnout, and 3, voter ID laws discriminate against minorities and low-income citizens. So in her first secondary claim, she had stated that voter ID laws suppress voters. So she went on to give us a fact that said 11% of Americans do not have government-issued photo identification, such as a driver's license or a passport. And in this argument, she was also saying that it was really hard for people to gain access to voting and stuff like that because they don't have some sort of identification. But what I found was that what she had failed to mention with her evidence is that people who want to vote can go get a free voter ID card, which allows people to vote for the time being. And it's a pretty simple task. You don't necessarily have to go in to go get it done. You could go ahead and fill out a form on the DMV website. And I found that you will need to fill out an application supplied by the government agency and present 1 or more documents proving your identity. And in Texas, voter ID applicants are also fingerprinted. And that was according to Claire McAdams, who's a teacher in political science. And the actual government website also states that there are multiple ways to vote, whether it be getting a free voter ID or like the photo identification or documents like birth certificates or some form of bank statement to affirm your identity. You could even also fill out a form. So in other words, when my opponent expressed how it is difficult to get any identification to vote during her claim of fact speech, she neglected to provide evidence that there are easy ways to gain access to voting. So the second challenge of evidence I would like to relay was that my opponent neglected to provide the evidence of the 2016 election when ID laws were passed. So during the 2016 presidential election for the United States, there was controversy on if the voter ID laws being passed at the time were used to rig the election in a specific way, mainly leaning towards the right. So I found a fact by Zachary Roth, a national reporter for NBC News, that expressed one of the main issues of the 2016 ID laws. So when Wisconsin's defiance has been the most glaring, last month, U.S. District Judge James Peterson ruled that the state's hyper-strict voter ID law could stay in place only if IDs were made freely available to any eligible voter who needed one. Lawyers for that state pledged that as long as voters went to a DMV office and presented whatever documents they had, they would get a temporary voter ID in the mail within the week. For voting rights advocates who wanted the law struck down entirely, it was far from a perfect solution. After all, requiring a trip to the DMV adds another burden, especially for working people. So what was also said within this article was that they had volunteers go into the DMV to go ahead and test out if it was easier to gain voting rights. And so all in all, it's if my opponent had included the different excerpts of the 2016 election voter ID laws in her speech, she would have had a stronger backing to her main claim. And the last secondary claim I would like to mention was when my opponent said that voter ID laws discriminate against minorities and low-income students. She presented a fact saying strict photo identification laws have differentially negative impact on the turnout of Hispanics, Blacks, and mixed-race Americans in primaries and general elections, which was studied at UCSD. What she had failed to inform us was that in that article, it was said that after the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court case weakened federal oversight over state and county election laws. The debate over whether these and other more restrictive laws have discriminatory effects has mostly been waged in the realms of ideology and intent, with most existing studies relying on data limited by time, place, or bias. So in this quote, what we're really looking at is that it's mostly been waged in the realms of ideology and intent, with it only being relied on personal views. So which tells us that most of everything my opponent has said about the voting ID laws being discriminatory is all based on biased opinions and ideology. There are no facts to support her claim. So to conclude my refutation, my opponent failed to provide enough evidence to deem her claim of abolishing voter ID laws would increase voter participation in elections as plausible.
All right, everything's set up structurally at the beginning, that's fine. Your argument on the first point, talking about how these voter ID laws are problematic because people might not have IDs. You're doing the same thing that I heard in several other speeches, and I'm not sure why people are doing this. You're kind of making the arguments that, well, they failed to provide the other evidence here that says this. That's your job. Your job is to tell us why the argument that they presented is irrelevant because there's this other argument that suggests that it's unimportant, or there's a solution to the problem, or it's not a particularly significant problem. It's not a fault in their reasoning, it's a counterclaim to their argument. And people seem to be hesitant to make an argument here. I don't understand why disagreeing with somebody is such a problem. It's not, let's not do the evaluation thing. Make a claim and say, that doesn't apply. This won't happen. There is a solution. All you need is a declarative statement and the evidence that you've got there. I do think you need to cite your source on the information about the free IDs, because you go through this long thing. Then you do have a citation. I'm not sure where it started because there was a post citation that talks about that. So I think there might have been a citation there, but I don't know which part of the evidence it covers. Again, one of those things that we talked about on the first assignment that needs to be clarified. Like I said, it's not so much that the advocate neglected to provide these things as you are making an argument on this particular point. The Wisconsin thing on the second point is a little bit confusing because it sounds like the court upheld the law as long as people were able to get free ID, and that's what the state said that they would be happy to do. And I'm going, okay, so that seems like that mitigates it. It's legal. It's okay. People get free ID. And then you add on this other point that says, well, that goes against what the people wanted because they wanted to get rid of this other thing. And, there's still problems. I'm going, well, wait a second. That's the argument from the advocate, not your argument. So the fact that there are still problems would be the obligation of the other person to point that out. You are making an argument that says the courts have upheld it. The state's not charging anybody for these IDs, and it's easy for them to get. You make a reference to some study where people went into the DMV to get these IDs, and then I never heard what the results of that study were. So I don't know why you made a reference to that particular point. On the discrimination argument, you have an interesting idea here, and that is to suggest that all of the research that's being talked about on these points is primarily motivated by ideology and bias that people have over their political differences, as opposed to something that is objectively measured, done by an academic, independently verifiable. And I think that that's a reasonable challenge to make against the general evidence being presented by the other side. Although how it would differentiate your argument and your evidence, I'm not quite sure. It seems like that would be equally applicable on the other side as well. So although it's an interesting concept, it may cut both ways, and so I don't know that it helps you as much in the long run. All right, thank you.